The crystal glass in Julian Vance's hand caught the amber light of the chandelier, reflecting a man who believed he had finally outrun his past. Surrounded by his inner circle at Alexander's steakhouse in Cupertino, Julian leaned back, his Tom Ford suit sharp enough to cut glass. "You want to know about small scale?" he asked, his voice dripping with a condescension that silenced the table. "I spent 7 years married to a woman who thought scaling meant buying a bigger kiln for her watercolor tiles. While I was dreaming of bio-integrated AI, she was crying over the shipping costs of a hand-painted vase. Some people are born to build empires, others are born to build dollhouses. Let's toast to the empire." As the table erupted in laughter, Julian drank deeply, unaware that the dollhouse had already grown tall enough to cast a shadow over his entire world. The air in San Francisco always smelled of salt and ambition, but tonight, for Julian Vance, it smelled of victory. At 35, Julian was the poster child for the move fast and break things ethos of the Valley. His company, Aura Connect, was the talk of every newsletter from TechCrunch to The Information. They weren't just building a social network. They were building a neural interface that adjusted your digital environment based on real-time cortisol levels. It was intrusive, it was brilliant, and it was valued at $900 million. But Julian needed more. He needed the Series B. He needed the Kingmaker. "Leo, stop fidgeting. You're sweating through your shirt, and it's a Xenia. Have some respect for the fabric," Julian said, not looking away from the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse. Leo, the CTO, and the only person who had been with Julian since the garage days, wiped his palms on his slacks. "It's Elysian Ventures, Julian. They don't just give you money, they give you the world. But nobody has even seen C. Reed in person. Mark Andreessen supposedly tried to get a meeting for 6 months and got ghosted. Why did they say yes to us?" Julian turned, a predatory smile playing on his lips. "Because we're the best, Leo. Even a ghost knows a unicorn when they see one." To celebrate the verbal commitment from Elysian's frontman, Julian Croft, Julian had taken his senior staff to a dinner that cost more than most people's annual rent. The wine was a 2012 Screaming Eagle, and the egos were even more expensive. As the 4th bottle was uncorked, the conversation turned, as it often did among men who had traded their youth for equity, to the women they had left behind. "My ex-wife tried to sue for intellectual property because she suggested the UI color palette," mocked Marcus, the head of growth. Julian laughed, but his was louder, harsher. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of polished blue ceramic. It was a shard from a sparrow, a small sculpture his ex-wife Clara had made years ago. He used it as a fidget stone, a reminder of the mediocrity he had escaped. "You guys think that's bad?" Julian started, the wine loosening the hinges of his filter. "Clara, God, she was sweet, but she was an anchor. I remember the night I told her I was quitting Google to start Aura. We were in our tiny apartment in Oakland, the one where the heater rattled like a chainsaw. She looked at me with those wide, teary eyes and asked, 'But Julian, who's going to help me with the spring catalogue for Artisan's Forge?' He mimicked her voice in a high-pitched, mocking tone. The table roared. Artisan's Forge, a website that looked like it was designed in 1998, selling authentic pottery and hand-woven scarves. I told her, 'Clara, I'm trying to rewrite the human experience, and you're worried about scarves.' I left her the apartment, the rattling heater, and every single one of those pathetic clay birds. I told her she'd never amount to anything more than a housewife with a hobby. The last thing she said to me was, 'Success isn't just a number on a cap table, Julian.' Can you believe that? No wonder she's probably still in that Oakland basement celebrating a $20 sale on Etsy." He tossed the ceramic shard onto the table. It clattered against the fine china, a piece of junk in a room full of gold. "To the hobbyists," Julian toasted, "may they stay in their basements so we have room to fly." The next morning, the hangover was a dull throb, but the adrenaline of the upcoming meeting acted as a more potent stimulant. The drive to Palo Alto was conducted in a hushed, reverent silence. They passed the campuses of Google and Meta, but Julian didn't look at them. He was looking at the future. Elysian Ventures was located in an unassuming building on Sand Hill Road. It wasn't flashy. It didn't have a giant logo or a slide in the lobby. It was made of dark glass and reclaimed wood, the kind of quiet luxury that only billions can buy. Julian Croft met them in the lobby. He was a man who looked like he had been born in a suit, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "Julian." "Leo. Thank you for coming. The founder is expecting you." "The founder," Leo whispered, his voice cracking. "C. Reed is actually here." "She is," Croft said, his eyes flickering toward Julian Vance for a split second. "She takes a very personal interest in companies that aim to change the world." Julian Vance straightened his tie, feeling the familiar rush of the pitch. He had practiced his opening line 1,000 times. He would speak of paradigm shifts and emotional synchronization. He would show this mysterious billionaire that he was the alpha they had been waiting for. They were led into a conference room that overlooked a private courtyard. A single woman sat at the head of the table, her back turned to them as she looked out at the Japanese maples. Her hair was a sharp platinum bob, and her suit was a midnight navy that seemed to absorb the light. "Ma'am," Julian Croft said softly, "the team from Aura Connect is here." Julian Vance stepped forward, his hand extended, his most charming CEO smile locked into place. "C. Reed, it is a profound honor. I've followed your investments at Sequoia and Founders Fund for years. What you did with the e-commerce exit 3 years ago was..." The woman turned. The air didn't just leave the room. It felt as if the room itself had ceased to exist. Julian's hand stayed frozen in midair. The paradigm shift he was about to pitch became a physical weight in his stomach. The woman standing before him wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a Howard Hughes-type recluse. She was Clara. But it wasn't the Clara who smelled like wet clay and lavender. This woman radiated a cold, crystalline power. Her skin was glowing, her eyes were sharp and devoid of the softness that had once invited his mockery. On her desk sat a single object, a perfectly restored ceramic sparrow, the cracks filled with 24-karat gold, the Japanese art of kintsugi. "Hello, Julian," she said, her voice a calm, melodic cello that vibrated in his very marrow. "I believe you were about to tell me how you're going to change the world. Please, sit. I'm very interested to hear about your scale." Julian Vance felt his knees buckle. The ceramic shard in his pocket, the one he had used to mock her only hours before, suddenly felt like it was burning a hole through his skin. Clara leaned forward, her hands interlaced on the dark oak table. "You look surprised. Did you think I was still in the basement, Julian? Or were you too busy building your empire to notice that I bought the building you're standing in?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Julian had ever heard. The conference room, which Julian had entered as a conqueror, now felt like a pressurized chamber. The scent of hinoki wood incense and high-end espresso, which usually signaled success, now felt cloying, sticking to the back of Julian's throat. Clara, no, C. Reed, remained seated, her posture an exercise in effortless grace. She didn't look like a woman seeking vengeance. She looked like a woman who had forgotten Julian existed until he happened to walk across her radar. That was the most painful part. To be hated was one thing, but to be a mere line item in her schedule was a different kind of agony. "Julian," Leo whispered, his voice trembling like a leaf in a gale. Is that really her?" Julian couldn't find his voice. His mind was a chaotic gallery of images. Clara in an oversized sweater, her fingers stained with terracotta. Clara crying as he packed his bags. Clara's face in the rearview mirror as he drove toward a life he thought was better. He looked at the woman before him. The navy suit was Chanel, tailored so perfectly it looked like a second skin. Her presence didn't just fill the room, it dictated the room's temperature. "I believe my associate, Mr. Croft, offered you coffee," Clara said, her voice cool and crisp, like fine linen. "But perhaps we should get straight to the data. You were speaking about emotional synchronization in the lobby." "I've read the pitch deck, Julian. I've seen the projections, but I want to hear the human element. After all, you've always been so focused on the big picture." Julian swallowed hard, the bile of pride rising in his throat. He opened his laptop, but his fingers were clumsy. The sleek Aura Connect logo, a pulsing, iridescent circle, appeared on the massive OLED screen on the wall. "Right, yes," Julian stammered. He cleared his throat, trying to summon the titan of tech persona he had spent years perfecting. Aura Connect it's about bridging the gap between digital interaction and biological reality. We've developed a wearable that tracks skin conductance and heart rate variability to... "I know what the tech does, Julian," Clara interrupted, not unkindly, but with a terrifying precision. "I want to know about the ethics. You're collecting the most intimate data imaginable, how a person feels when they see a specific advertisement or a specific person. What is the soul of this company? Or is it just another way to sell targeted ads for luxury goods?" Julian saw an opening. He thought he knew Clara. He thought her softness was still there, waiting to be exploited. This was his first mistake, assuming the woman who once loved him was the same woman who now sat in judgment of him. "Clara." "Sorry, C. Reed," Julian said, softening his voice, trying to inject that old, familiar warmth that used to make her smile. "You know me. You know I've always dreamed of this. I've always wanted to build something that lasts. Aura Connect is about connection. It's about the very thing we used to talk about in that old apartment, understanding people. I've just scaled that understanding." Clara's expression didn't change, but the light in her eyes seemed to harden. "The apartment in Oakland, with the rattling heater?" She tilted her head, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I remember that place. I remember you telling me that understanding people was a hobby unless it could be monetized at $1 billion valuation. I remember you saying my work was insignificant because it didn't have a global footprint." She stood up slowly and walked toward the window. Julian followed her gaze. Below them, Sand Hill Road was a river of Teslas and Porsches. "You called it Artisan's Forge," she said, her back to him. "You saw watercolor tiles and hand-woven scarves. You saw a dollhouse. What you failed to see, Julian, was the back end. You were so busy staring at your own reflection in your Google monitor that you didn't notice I was building the first decentralized logistics network for independent creators. I didn't just sell pottery. I built the infrastructure that allowed 40,000 women to bypass the very corporate gatekeepers you worship." She turned around, her eyes locking onto his. "I sold Artisan's Forge to Amazon for $1.2 billion 3 years ago, not because of the pretty vases, but because my shipping algorithm was 14% more efficient than theirs. I took that money and built Elysian. I didn't move fast and break things, Julian. I moved quietly and built things." Leo looked like he wanted to crawl under the reclaimed wood table. Julian felt the world tilting. The woman he had mocked as a hobbyist had outperformed him before he had even closed his Series A. She wasn't just his investor. She was his superior in every metric of the game he played. Julian took a desperate breath. He made his second and most fatal mistake. He tried to reclaim the power through a display of shared history. "Look, Clara," he said, stepping closer, ignoring the warning glance from Julian Croft. "I get it. You've done incredibly well, better than I could have imagined. And maybe I was a little harsh back then. But we were young. We were stressed. You know how the valley is. But isn't this perfect? The two of us, back together, building the next great empire. It's like it was meant to be. We're a power couple. Think of the press. Think of the narrative. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to die away. Julian Croft, standing by the door, actually winced. Clara Reed looked at Julian Vance as if he were a bug under a microscope, a specimen that was no longer interesting, merely an obstacle. A power couple, she repeated, the words sounding like ice cubes clinking in a glass. Julian, we are not a couple. We are a venture capital firm and a founder with a dwindling runway and a burn rate that has you 3 months away from insolvency. She walked back to the table and picked up the kintsugi sparrow. She ran her thumb over the gold-filled cracks. You think this is a romantic comedy, she said quietly. You think you can flash that smile, mention our marriage, and I'll write a check for $100 million because of what we had. But you forgot one thing about our marriage, Julian. She leaned in, her face inches from his. He could smell her perfume, something dark, expensive, and entirely unfamiliar. You didn't leave because I was small-scale. You left because you were afraid that if I succeeded, you wouldn't be the most important person in the room. You wanted a cheerleader, not a partner, and now you've walked into my room, and in this room you are the smallest thing here. Julian felt his face flush a deep, humiliated red. Are you passing on the deal? He managed to choke out. Is this all just a long-winded way to say no, to get your revenge? Clara set the sparrow down with a deliberate clack. Revenge is a low-margin emotion, Julian. I don't invest in it, she said. The tech is solid. Leo's architecture is brilliant. But you are a liability. You're arrogant. You're dismissive of small data. And you've built a culture of toxicity. I saw you at Alexander's steakhouse last night. Julian's heart stopped. I have a standing reservation at the booth behind yours, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I heard everything you said about me, about the hobbyist, about the housewife. I heard the laughter of your employees as you mocked the woman who supported you when you had nothing. She picked up a sleek silver fountain pen. I'm not going to say no, Julian. I'm going to give you exactly what you asked for. I'm going to fund Aura Connect. For a split second, Julian felt a surge of relief. He had won. He had survived. But, Clara added, the word hanging in the air like a guillotine, there are conditions. Conditions that will require you to give up the one thing you value more than money. She pushed a single sheet of paper across the table. It wasn't a standard term sheet. It was something else. Julian's eyes scanned the page, and his face went from red to a ghostly, sickly white. You can't be serious, he whispered. I am as serious as the $100 million I'm prepared to wire, Clara said, leaning back and crossing her legs. The choice is yours, Julian. You can save your empire, or you can save your ego. You can't have both. The paper felt heavier than a lead weight in Julian's hands. The high-grade bond paper was cool to the touch, but the words printed on it burned. He stared at the clause highlighted in a bold, unapologetic font. Section 12.4, Leadership, Atonement, and Equity Reallocation. You're asking for 20% of my personal founder's shares, Julian whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. That's not an investment. That's a seizure. It's a reallocation of resources, Clara corrected, her tone as smooth as the polished marble floors. Those shares won't go to Elysian. They will be the seed capital for the Phoenix Initiative, a foundation I chair that supports female entrepreneurs from non-traditional backgrounds. Specifically, women whose ambitions were deemed too small by men with bigger microphones. Julian Croft stepped forward, placing a tablet on the table. It was already cued to a video. Julian Vance felt a cold sweat prickle at his hairline. And then there's the matter of the moral integrity clause, Croft said. He pressed play. The audio was muffled but unmistakable. It was the sound of Alexander's steakhouse. The clinking of glasses, the raucous laughter, and then Julian's own voice, amplified and chillingly clear. I told her she'd never amount to anything more than a housewife with a hobby. May they enjoy their quiet, simple, and profoundly insignificant lives. The video wasn't shot by a spy. It was a story posted by a tech influencer who had been sitting 3 tables away, someone Julian had been trying to impress for months. It had 600,000 views and a comment section that was currently tearing Aura Connect's inclusive brand to shreds. In the valley, Julian, reputation is the only currency that doesn't deflate, Clara said, her eyes fixed on the screen as the video looped his mocking laughter. This video leaked an hour ago. Your lead engineers are already tweeting their resignations. Your Glassdoor rating is plummeting. You didn't just mock me, you mocked the very demographic that makes up 60% of your projected user base. Julian sank into the chair, the titan of tech crumbling into a pile of expensive suit fabric and shattered nerves. He looked at Leo, his CTO, his friend. Leo wouldn't look at him. He was staring at the floor, his face flushed with shame. Julian, I told you to stop. I told you it was too much. The deal is simple, Clara continued, ignoring the drama as if it were a minor weather pattern. Elysian provides the $100 million. We stabilize the PR by announcing that C. Reed, a woman you once underestimated, is now your primary partner. We frame it as a full-circle moment of growth. But in exchange, you step down as chairman. You remain CEO, but you report to a board of 3, Julian Croft, myself, and a 3rd member of my choosing. She paused, the silence stretching like a taut wire. And finally, the mentoring. 10 hours a week. You will sit in the communal workspace of the Phoenix Initiative. You will look these women in the eye. You will help them scale their doll houses into the empires they deserve. You will use your brilliance to build others up, because for 10 years you've only used it to look down. Julian felt a surge of indignation, the YouTube drama of it all. The public shaming, the forced humility. It was a nightmare. You're trying to house-train me, Clara. You're trying to break me. No, Julian, she said, standing up and walking toward him. She stopped just inches away, so close he could see the tiny gold flecks in her irises. The same eyes that used to look at him with such adoration. Now they looked at him with the wisdom of a woman who had walked through fire and come out as steel. I'm trying to make you a man worth the tech you built. Aura Connect is a masterpiece of empathy tracking, but you have no empathy. You're a doctor who's never felt a heartbeat. If you want my money, you have to learn to feel. She picked up the silver fountain pen and held it out to him. The room seemed to shrink. Julian looked at the pen, then at the kintsugi sparrow on the desk. He thought about the board meetings, the magazine covers, the billion-dollar valuation. If he said no, Aura Connect would die by Friday. The ghost investor would vanish. The video would continue to viralize, and he would be remembered as the arrogant prick who lost it all because he couldn't stop mocking his ex-wife. If he said yes, he would be a king in a golden cage, ruled by the woman he had treated as a footnote. His hand shook as he reached for the pen. His fingers brushed hers, a brief electric contact that sent a jolt of memory through him. For a split second, he wasn't a CEO and she wasn't a billionaire. They were just 2 people in a drafty apartment, sharing a pizza and dreaming of a future that had turned out to be much more complicated than either had imagined. He pressed the nib to the paper. The blue ink bled into the grain, a permanent record of his surrender. Julian Vance. He dropped the pen. It rolled across the table, leaving a thin trail of ink like a surgical scar. The wire transfer will be initiated once the public statement is drafted, Clara said, her voice returning to its professional boardroom-ready clip. Julian Croft will walk you through the onboarding for the Phoenix Initiative. You start Monday, 8 a.m. Don't be late, Julian. We don't tolerate a lack of discipline at Elysian. Julian stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him at the door. "One more thing, Julian." He turned, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. Maybe she would say something kind. Maybe the mask would slip. "The sparrow," she said, gesturing to the kintsugi bird. "I didn't find it in the trash. I bought it back from the woman you sold our storage unit to for $500 when you decided my junk wasn't worth the moving fee. She told me you laughed when you handed her the key." Clara's smile was small, sharp, and utterly devastating. "She's now my head of logistics. She's the one who's going to be auditing your server costs. I'd suggest being very, very polite to her." Julian Vance walked out of the dark glass building and into the blinding California sun. The air felt different now. The salt was gone. All that was left was the bitter, metallic taste of a reckoning he had earned, 1 cent at a time. He got into his car, but he didn't start the engine. He just sat there, staring at his hands. He was $100 million richer, but as he watched Clara's silhouette through the smoked glass of the top floor, he had never felt more bankrupt. Monday morning in San Francisco arrived with a persistent grey fog that seemed to mirror Julian Vance's internal weather. He stood outside a refurbished brick warehouse in the Mission District, a far cry from the glass spires of Sand Hill Road. There was no valet, no biometric scanner, and certainly no receptionists trained to whisper his name like a prayer. Above the heavy oak doors, a simple sign in brushed brass read, "The Phoenix Initiative." Julian adjusted the cuffs of his blazer, a habit of a man who used his wardrobe as a shield. He felt a phantom weight in his chest, the literal debt of 10 hours a week. He pushed the doors open and was immediately hit by a sensory assault he wasn't prepared for. It didn't smell like the sterile, ionized air of Aura Connect. It smelled of roasting coffee, wet clay, fresh ink, and a hum of human activity that felt dangerously unoptimized. There were no focus pods or zen zones. Instead, there were long communal tables, walls covered in butcher paper and frantic Sharpie scribbles, and the sound of women arguing over supply chains and user interface. "Mr. Vance, you're 3 minutes late." Julian turned to see a woman in her late 40s, wearing a denim workshirt and a look of profound unimpressiveness. This was Sarah Jenkins, the woman who had bought his discarded life for $500. "Sarah," Julian said, trying to inject a note of professional camaraderie into his voice. "Good to see you again." Sarah didn't smile. She held a digital stopwatch in her hand, the red digits ticking. "It's Sarah to you, but in this building, I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Phoenix portfolio. Clara, Ms. Reed, doesn't have time to show you to your seat. Follow me." She led him through the maze of desks. Julian felt the eyes. It was a physical heat on the back of his neck. The video from Alexander's Steakhouse hadn't just gone viral, it had become the foundational text of his reputation here. As he walked past a group of 3 young women huddled over a laptop, he heard a distinct, sharp snort of derision. "Your office," Sarah said, stopping at a small plywood desk in the very center of the open-plan room. Julian stared at it. It was positioned right next to the coffee station and the heavy traffic path to the restrooms. It was the least private, most exposed spot in the entire building. On the desk sat a single cheap plastic kitchen timer and a stack of file folders. "There must be a mistake," Julian said, his voice lowering to a defensive hiss. "I'm here to provide high-level strategic consulting. I need a space where I can—" "You're here to work, Julian," Sarah interrupted, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding tables. Ms. Reed's instructions were very specific. "You aren't a consultant here. You are a resource. You sit where the people who need you can find you, and right now, Maya needs you." Sarah gestured to a young woman sitting at the end of the table. She looked no older than 24, with frantic curls and a sweatshirt that read, "Code like a girl." She was staring at a pile of fabric swatches and a tablet with a look of pure desperation. Maya is building Loom and Logic, Sarah explained. It's a platform that uses AI to help traditional weavers in Peru and Guatemala price their goods based on global market fluctuations and thread density. It's small scale, Julian. Quaint. A hobby, right? The sarcasm was a serrated blade. Sarah tapped the kitchen timer. Your 10 hours start now. Don't waste her time. She's actually trying to build a future. Sarah walked away, leaving Julian standing in the center of the bullpen, feeling like a disgraced king forced to sweep the streets of his former kingdom. He sat down, the cheap chair creaking under his weight. He looked at Maya, who was avoiding his gaze, her cheeks flushed a deep pink. "Maya, is it?" Julian asked, trying to summon the voice he used for keynote speeches. "Let's look at your tech stack. If we can optimize the latency on the—" "I don't care about the latency, Mr. Vance," Maya said, finally looking up. Her eyes weren't filled with the awe he was used to. They were filled with a weary, sharp intelligence. "I care about the fact that my weavers are being cheated by middlemen because they don't understand how the price of organic cotton is being manipulated in New York. I need an algorithm that explains the why, not just the what. But I suppose you think that's a dollhouse problem." Julian felt the sting. The dollhouse comment was going to haunt him for the rest of his life. He looked at her tablet. The UI was clunky, the logic was circular, and the data visualization looked like a child's drawing. Everything in his billionaire brain told him to tell her to scrap it and start over, to tell her it wasn't scalable, to tell her she was thinking too small. But he felt a sudden sharp memory of Clara in their Oakland kitchen, trying to explain the soul of a clay vase to him while he checked his stock options. He had tuned her out then. He had looked at the smallness of her dream and used it as a reason to leave. He looked at Maya again. She wasn't a hobbyist, she was a fighter, and she was terrified. "Show me the middlemen data," Julian said, his voice losing some of its performative edge. "If we can't beat them on scale, we beat them on transparency. We don't need a global footprint yet. We just need to make it impossible for them to lie to your weavers." For the next 4 hours, Julian did something he hadn't done in years. He listened. He didn't interrupt with buzzwords. He didn't check his phone. He sat in the noisy, chaotic heart of the Phoenix Initiative and let a 24-year-old girl teach him about the ethics of textile pricing. He realized with a sickening jolt of clarity that Maya was more of a CEO than he had been in a long time. She knew her users' names. She knew their children's names. She was building a business out of a genuine, aching need, whereas he had built Aura Connect out of a desire for a higher valuation. Around 1 p.m., the room went quiet. The kind of quiet that only happens when a predator enters the forest. Julian looked up. Clara was standing on the mezzanine level, looking down at the bullpen. She was dressed in a sharp white suit, her platinum hair catching the overhead lights like a halo of ice. She wasn't looking at the building. She was looking at him. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply watched him sitting at his plywood desk covered in Maya's fabric swatches, looking like a man who had finally realized he was lost. She turned to Julian Croft, who was standing beside her with a clipboard. "How is the resource performing?" she asked, her voice carrying through the rafters. "He's on hour 5, Clara," Croft replied. "He hasn't left the desk, not even for lunch." Clara nodded slowly. She walked down the stairs, her heels clicking a rhythmic, intimidating beat on the concrete floor. She stopped at Julian's desk. Maya stood up immediately, looking like she wanted to curtsy. "Maya," Clara said, her voice softening into a genuine warmth. "How is the mentorship going? Is the Titan providing any value?" Maya looked at Julian, then at Clara. He actually figured out the transparency algorithm, Ms. Reed. He didn't try to make it a revolution. He just made it work." Clara's eyes flicked to Julian. For a split second, the CEO mask slipped, and he saw a flicker of the girl who used to bake him birthday cakes when they couldn't afford a gift. There was a glimmer of something. Not forgiveness, but perhaps a clinical curiosity. "Good," Clara said, her voice regaining its edge. "Make sure he logs his hours correctly. I don't pay for idle time." She turned to leave, but Julian found himself standing up. "Clara, wait." She stopped, her back to him. The entire room held its breath. "I looked at the Artisan's Forge archives this morning," Julian said, his voice low, intended only for her. "I saw the logistics paper you wrote in 2018, the one about hyper-local hubs. I didn't read it back then. I just saw the title and told you it was too niche." He swallowed, the weight of the confession heavy in the air. "You weren't building a dollhouse. You were building a map for a world I didn't even know existed." Clara didn't turn around. Her shoulders stayed rigid. "I know what I was building, Julian. The tragedy isn't that I succeeded. The tragedy is that you had a front-row seat to a masterpiece and you chose to stare at a wall." She walked away, the doors of the initiative swinging shut behind her. Julian sat back down. His plastic kitchen timer let out a shrill, piercing beep. Hour 5 was over. He had 5 more to go today. He looked at Maya, who was watching him with a new, quiet kind of pity. "You're really sorry, aren't you?" she asked. Julian looked at the wooden surface of the desk, at the coffee stains and the scratches. "Being sorry is easy, Maya," he whispered. "Being a different person is the hard part." Just as he reached for the next file, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Leo, back at Aura Connect. "Julian, we have a problem. The Series B news leaked early but with a twist. The press is reporting that you're being forced out by C. Reed. TechCrunch just posted, 'The Queen takes her revenge.' Our stock is in a freefall. We need a statement. Now." Julian looked at the text, then at the room full of women who were building their dreams with nothing but grit and a few plywood desks. He realized that the world he once ruled was burning down, and the only person with the fire extinguisher was the woman who had every reason to let him turn to ash. The drive from the Mission District back to Aura Connect's headquarters in Soma felt like a descent into a war zone. As Julian's Tesla glided toward the building, he saw them, the vultures. A swarm of paparazzi and tech culture vloggers were gathered at the entrance, their ring lights glowing like neon eyes in the drizzling rain. Julian pulled his hood up, an act of anonymity that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He slipped through the freight entrance, the metallic clang of the heavy door echoing in the loading dock. Inside, the usual hum of high-productivity energy had been replaced by a frantic, vibrating panic. He stepped into the main lobby and the silence was instantaneous. His employees, men and women who had worshipped him like a digital deity, were staring. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others, younger and more emboldened by the viral video, looked at him with naked contempt. On the giant digital wall that usually displayed the company's real-time emotional global reach, the map was a pulsing, angry red. "Julian!" Leo ran toward him, his face a mask of exhaustion. His tie was loosened, and he was clutching a tablet like a shield. "The board is in your office. They've been there for 2 hours. Julian Croft is with them. They're calling for an emergency vote on your removal." "They can't remove me, Leo. I have the super voting shares," Julian snapped, his old arrogance flickering like a dying candle. "You had them, Julian," Leo whispered, his voice cracking. "Section 12.4. Remember, when you signed the Elysian deal, you converted those shares. You're at the mercy of the board now, and the board is at the mercy of the press." Julian felt a cold, sickening hollow open in his gut. He had walked into Clara's trap with his eyes wide open, blinded by the $100 million. He had traded his throne for a lifeline, not realizing the lifeline was a noose. He pushed through the double glass doors of his corner office. The room was dark, lit only by the city lights and the soft glow of a dozen MacBook logos. Julian Croft stood by the window, his silhouette sharp and immovable. The other 3 board members, heavyweights from traditional VC firms, sat in the leather chairs, their expressions grim. "Julian," Croft said, not turning around. "The TechCrunch article was just the beginning. The New York Times is running a piece tomorrow morning. The Toxic Titan, how Aura Connect's founder built an empire on diminishment. They have interviews, Julian, former assistants, junior developers, even the waiter from Alexander's." "It's a hit piece," Julian shouted, his voice echoing off the glass. "It's a narrative being pushed by people who don't understand how this industry works. We're building the future. You don't build a billion-dollar company by being nice to everyone. You don't build one by being a liability either," one of the board members said, a man named Arthur, who had known Julian's father. "The stock is down 30% in after-hours trading. Our retail partners are threatening to pull the wearable integration. They don't want to be associated with a brand that mocks women." Julian Croft finally turned. He held up a single physical piece of paper, a resignation letter. "Sign it, Julian. Step down as CEO. We'll announce you're taking a sabbatical for personal growth. We'll appoint an interim. It's the only way the markets will stabilize." Julian looked at the paper. This was it. The end of the Titan. He thought about the bullpen at the Phoenix Initiative. He thought about Maya and her weavers. He thought about the $100 million wire transfer that was currently the only thing keeping the lights on in this building. "Where is she?" Julian asked, his voice low. "Ms. Reed is in transit," Croft replied. "No," Julian said, stepping toward him. "Where is Clara? This is her play, isn't it? She didn't just want the shares. She wanted to watch me sign the death warrant of my own career." "She didn't write that article, Julian," Croft said quietly. "You wrote it every time you opened your mouth over the last 10 years. She just happened to be the one holding the mirror when you finally looked into it." Suddenly, the office door slid open. Clara walked in. She wasn't wearing a suit this time. She was wearing a simple, high-necked black sweater and trousers, her hair slightly damp from the rain. She looked less like a billionaire and more like the woman she had been, the one Julian had discarded. "Out," she said to the board members. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of an apex predator. They didn't argue. They filed out, even Julian Croft, leaving Julian and Clara alone in the darkened glass castle. The silence was thick, heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 arguments. Julian stood behind his massive oak desk, the desk he had bought to prove he was a king. Clara stood in the center of the room, looking at the restored ceramic sparrow sitting on his bookshelf. "You're really going to do it," Julian said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and grief. "You're going to take it all, my company, my name, my life's work." Clara walked over to the bookshelf and picked up the sparrow. She ran her finger over the gold-filled cracks. "Do you remember the night you broke this, Julian?" Julian frowned. "What?" "We were in the apartment. I had just gotten my first order for 10 vases from a hotel in Napa. I was so excited I was shaking. I wanted to celebrate. You came home and told me you had been passed over for a promotion at Google. You were so angry. You looked at the sparrow on the table and you swept it off. You didn't even apologize. You just said, 'Why are you playing with mud when I'm trying to survive?'" Julian felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest. I don't remember that." "Of course you don't. It was just a Tuesday for you. But for me, it was the moment I realized that my joy was an insult to your ego." She put the sparrow back on the shelf. "I'm not taking your company, Julian. I'm trying to save it. But I can't save Aura Connect if the man at the top is still the man who broke that bird." "I've been at the initiative," Julian yelled, gesturing wildly. "I've sat at that plywood desk. I've mentored Maya. I'm doing the work, Clara." "Are you?" she asked, stepping closer. "Or are you just performing penance so you can get back to your glass office? Are you sorry for what you said, or are you sorry that someone recorded it?" Julian opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words died in his throat. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a rival, but the person who knew him better than anyone in the world. He saw the person who had seen his potential before he had a dime and whom he had punished for that very kindness. The office phone buzzed. It was Leo's voice, sounding panicked. "Julian, the hackers, they've bypassed the firewall. They're dumping the biometric data. The emotional logs of our top 10,000 users are being uploaded to the dark web right now. We're losing control." Julian's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a PR crisis anymore. It was a catastrophe. The very emotional synchronization he had bragged about was now a weapon against his users. He looked at the dashboard. The red pulses were speeding up. The company was dying in real time. "I can fix it," Julian said, his hands hovering over the keyboard. "I know the backdoor logic. I can shut it down, but I need to bypass the security protocols. It'll take hours." "You don't have hours," Clara said, her eyes fixed on the screen. She pulled a small encrypted thumb drive from her pocket. "This is the decentralized security layer I built for Artisan's Forge. I never sold this part to Amazon. I kept it. It's designed to isolate and encrypt data at the source rather than the server." Julian stared at the drive. "You had this the whole time? Why didn't you offer it as part of the deal?" "Because," Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I needed to know if you would ask for help, or if you would rather let the empire burn than admit that a housewife had the solution you couldn't build." The red light on the dashboard flared, illuminating Julian's face in a bloody glow. He looked at the resignation letter on the desk, then at the thumb drive in Clara's hand. The choice was no longer about his career. It was about the 10,000 people whose private lives were about to be exposed because of his hubris. "Help me," Julian whispered. He didn't say it like a CEO. He said it like a man who was drowning. Clara handed him the drive. "Don't just plug it in, Julian. You have to hand over the master keys to the architecture. If I save this company, it won't be yours anymore. It'll be ours. A true partnership. No more titans, no more dollhouses. Just the work." Julian took the drive. His hand was shaking. He knew that by doing this, he was signing away the last of his control. He was admitting that he wasn't the kingmaker. He looked at Clara. "If I do this, will you ever be able to look at me without seeing the man who broke the bird?" Clara didn't answer. She just pointed at the screen. "The upload is at 40%, Julian. Make a choice." Julian Vance took a breath that felt like it was tearing his lungs. He reached out and plugged the drive into the server port. The atmosphere in the Aura Connect war room was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt coffee. Outside, the San Francisco rain had turned into a torrential downpour, blurring the lights of the city into a smear of neon blue and grey. Inside, the only light came from the massive wall of monitors, currently a chaotic grid of scrolling code and red alert icons. Julian Vance's fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic click-clack the only sound in the room. Beside him, Clara, C. Reed, was a statue of calm. She wasn't typing, she was watching. Her eyes tracked the data packets as her decentralized protocol began to wrap the breach like a digital bandage. "It's working," Julian whispered, his voice hoarse. "The upload has stalled at 42%. Your architecture. It's treating the hacker's intrusion as a corrupted node and isolating it. It's not just stopping them, it's making the data they already took unreadable." "It's called the Hive Shield," Clara said softly, her eyes never leaving the screen. "I designed it for the weavers and the potters. They didn't have money for expensive firewalls, so I had to build something that made the data itself defensive." Julian paused for a second, his hands hovering over the keys. He looked at her, the blue light of the monitors carving deep shadows into his tired face. "I spent 10 years calling your work quaint, and here I am, using a pottery app algorithm to save $1 billion AI company." "The scale doesn't change the logic, Julian," she replied. "Integrity is the same whether you're selling a $5 mug or a $500 wearable." "Boss!" The door burst open. Leo ran in, followed by Emily, the lead encryption engineer. Both looked like they had been through a car crash. "The breach is contained," Emily reported, her eyes wide as she looked at Clara's drive. "What the hell is that thing? It's eating the malware. I've never seen anything like it." "It's the future of Aura," Clara said, finally turning to the team. She looked at Julian. "But the tech is only half the battle. The world knows we were hit. The dark web forums are already claiming they have the data. If we don't speak now, the narrative will be that we're incompetent and toxic." "I'll have PR draft a statement," Julian said, reaching for his desk phone. "We can blame the third-party server provider. We can—" "No!" Clara's voice was like a gavel. Julian stopped. "No more spin, Julian," she said, walking toward him. She took the phone out of his hand and set it back on the hook. "That's the old way. That's the way that leads to Alexander's Steakhouse. You aren't going to hide behind a press release. You're going to go out there on a live stream, and you're going to tell them exactly what happened, and you're going to tell them who saved you." Julian felt a surge of the old panic. A live stream. Now I look like a ghost. The press will tear me apart. If I admit that my own architecture failed and I had to rely on your tech, the investors will— "The investors are already gone, Julian," Clara interrupted. "The only people left are the users, the people whose heartbeats and secrets you promised to protect. Do you want to be the titan who lied to them, or the man who finally told the truth?" She pointed toward the glass-walled studio at the end of the hall, the Creator Lab. Julian looked at Leo. His co-founder nodded slowly. "She's right, Jules. We can't lie our way out of this one, not this time." 10 minutes later, Julian was sitting in a high-backed stool in the studio. A single 4K camera was pointed at his face. The Go Live light flickered a menacing red. In his ear, Julian Croft was giving him the count. "We have 2 million people waiting on the stream," Croft's voice crackled. "TechCrunch, CNBC, and every major influencer in the valley is watching. Don't fuck this up, Vance." Julian looked through the glass. Clara was standing in the shadows, her arms crossed. She wasn't holding a script. She wasn't giving him a thumbs up. She was just there, a witness. 5, 4, 3. The light turned solid red. "My name is Julian Vance," he started, his voice shaking slightly before he steadied it. He looked directly into the lens, seeing his own reflection in the glass. "And tonight, I failed you." He didn't use the teleprompter. He didn't use the visionary buzzwords. For 20 minutes, Julian spoke with a raw, unvarnished honesty that felt like he was skinning himself alive. He detailed the breach. He admitted that his ego had led him to overlook security flaws because he was too focused on growth. And then he did the unthinkable. "For the last few days, you've seen a video of me," Julian said, his eyes stinging. "A video of me mocking my ex-wife, Clara Reed. I told my team she was insignificant. I told them she was a hobbyist. I said she would never amount to anything." He took a jagged breath. "I was wrong, not just about her career, but about her character. Tonight, when Aura Connect was burning down, I didn't have the solution. The man you called a visionary was helpless. The person who saved this company, the person who protected your data, is the woman I belittled. Clara Reed and her firm Elysian Ventures provided the technology that stopped this disaster." He looked toward the shadows where Clara stood. "I am stepping down as chairman of the board, effective immediately," Julian announced, the words feeling like a physical weight leaving his shoulders. "I will remain as CEO under the direct supervision of Clara Reed, because I've realized that I don't know how to lead a company that cares about people, but she does, and I'm going to spend every day for the rest of my life trying to learn that from her." He reached out and cut the feed himself. The silence in the studio was absolute. Julian sat in the dark, the cooling fans of the cameras the only sound. He felt empty. He felt finished. The studio door opened. Clara walked in. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just stood by the stool, looking at him. Julian didn't look up. He was staring at his hands, the same hands that had signed the divorce papers, the same hands that had swept the sparrow off the table. "That wasn't in the contract," she said quietly. "I know," Julian whispered. "You could have saved some face. You could have mentioned the Series B funding first." "I don't care about the face anymore, Clara. I just wanted to say it out loud, before the whole world." Clara reached out. For a moment, Julian thought she might touch his shoulder, but she stopped. Instead, she picked up a small, forgotten prop from a previous shoot. A simple clay mug, a sample from a mindful living campaign that Julian had once mocked as too earthy. "The stream comments are coming in," she said, her voice unreadable. "They're calling it the most honest moment in tech history. The stock is actually ticking back up. People like the truth, Julian. It's a rare commodity in this town." She set the mug down on the table with a soft thud. "But don't think this changes things," she added, her voice regaining its boardroom steel. "You still have your hours at the initiative. You still have to answer to Sarah. And tomorrow morning, we have a meeting with the regulators. You're going to tell them everything you told that camera." "I'll be there," Julian said. She turned to leave, but at the door she paused. She didn't look back, but her voice was different, softer, more like the girl from the Oakland kitchen. "You didn't look like a titan tonight, Julian," she said. Julian flinched. "I know. You look like a man," she said. "It's a much better look on you." She closed the door, leaving Julian alone in the studio. He looked at the clay mug. He reached out and touched the rough, unglazed surface. It was imperfect. It was small. It was real. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and for the first time in years, Julian Vance didn't feel like he was fighting the world. He just felt like he was finally standing on solid ground. 6 months later, the Palo Alto sun was a gentle, honeyed gold filtering through the skylights of the Phoenix Initiative. The warehouse had changed. It no longer felt like a chaotic bullpen to Julian. It felt like an ecosystem. The scent of roasted coffee was still there, but it was now mingled with the ozone of 3D printers and the faint, sweet smell of lavender from a new botanical tech startup in the corner. Julian Vance sat at his plywood desk. It was no longer a punishment. It was his favorite place to think. His Tom Ford suits were mostly in garment bags at the back of his closet. Today he wore a simple charcoal sweater and dark jeans. His hair was a little longer, his face a little leaner, and the frantic, predatory light in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady focus. Across from him, Maya was vibrating with an energy that could power a small city. Her tablet was open, displaying the final version of Loom and Logic. "We hit 10,000 active users this morning, Julian," she whispered, as if saying it too loud might break the spell. "The weavers in the Quiché region, they've increased their profit margins by 40%. They're building a community center, a school." Julian looked at the data. He didn't see a niche market anymore. He didn't see small scale. He saw the faces of the women he had met over Zoom, the calloused hands, the intricate patterns of their heritage, the way they looked at the screen with hope because someone had finally given them a tool that didn't try to exploit them. "It's not just the numbers, Maya," Julian said, his voice grounded. "It's the sovereignty. You didn't just give them a platform. You gave them their power back. That's the real ROI. Maya beamed. "I'm heading to the airport. I'm going to meet them, in person." She paused, looking at Julian with a warmth that still felt surreal to him. "Thank you for not trying to make it a unicorn, for just making it real." As Maya hurried away, Julian felt a shadow fall over his desk. He looked up. Clara Ara Reed stood there. She was wearing a soft cream-colored coat, her platinum hair tucked behind one ear. She looked younger than she had in the boardroom, the hardness in her expression replaced by a thoughtful, observing calm. "Sarah told me I'd find you here," she said. My 10 hours ended 3 hours ago, Julian said, leaning back in his creaky chair. I wanted to finish the audit for the new cohort. Clara looked around the room. Her eyes lingered on the communal table where 3 women were debating a sustainable packaging algorithm. Aura Connect's quarterly report came out yesterday. The new empathy-first privacy model is the industry standard now. Apple is even looking to license your Hive Shield tech. The board is happy, Julian said with a shrug. Leo is actually sleeping more than 4 hours a night. The company is stable, Clara. It's healthy. And the CEO? She asked, her voice soft. Julian looked down at his hands. The CEO realized that his kingdom was a cage. I don't miss the glass office, Clara. I don't miss the steakhouse. I spent my whole life trying to be the biggest person in the room because I was terrified of being the smallest. But being insignificant? It's actually quite liberating. Clara walked around the desk and sat in the guest chair, the same one Maya had just vacated. She pulled a small box from her bag. It was wrapped in simple, hand-pressed paper, the kind of paper she used to make in their Oakland apartment. I found this while I was moving some of the Elysian archives to the new building, she said, sliding the box toward him. Julian opened it. Inside was a ceramic mug. It was one of the very first pieces she had ever fired. It was slightly lopsided, the blue glaze uneven, but on the bottom, in her small, neat handwriting, were the words, "For the dreamer." I thought I'd thrown it out the day I left, Clara said, but I realized I'd hidden it in the back of a closet. I think I was waiting for the day I could look at it without feeling like a failure. Julian ran his thumb over the uneven glaze. I used to hate this mug. I told you it was amateur. It was, Clara said, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. But it was also honest. We were broke, we were dreaming, and we were together. I spent a long time trying to build an empire just to prove to you that my mud was worth more than your code. But seeing you with Maya today, I realized I don't need to prove anything anymore. Julian felt a lump in his throat. I'm so sorry, Clara. Not for the money, or the tech, or the video. I'm sorry that I made you feel like you had to build a wall around yourself just to survive me. Clara reached across the plywood desk. Her hand hovered for a second, then she laid it over his. Her skin was warm. It wasn't the electric judgment of the boardroom anymore. It was human. The kintsugi sparrow is in my office at home, she said. I look at it every morning. It reminded me for a long time of the pain, but lately I've been looking at the gold. The parts that were broken are the strongest parts now. Julian looked at her, seeing the woman he had loved, the woman he had wronged, and the woman who had ultimately saved him from himself. Where do we go from here, Clara? Professionally, I mean. Professionally. We continue, she said, her voice regaining its quiet authority. Elysian is launching a global fund for sustainable tech. I want Aura Connect to be the anchor. But I want the Phoenix Initiative to be the heart. I'd like you to take a seat on the Elysian Advisory Board. Not because of the contract, Julian, but because I think you finally understand the scale of what we're doing. Julian nodded, the weight of the offer settling over him. It wasn't a restoration of his old power. It was the birth of a new kind of responsibility. I'd like that, he said. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the warehouse continuing around them. It wasn't a romantic reconciliation. The scars were too deep for a simple, happily ever after. But it was something better. It was an acknowledgement, a truce, a bridge built over a decade of wreckage. Clara stood up, adjusting her coat. I have a meeting with the governor's office, but Sarah is organizing a dinner for the founders tonight. Nothing fancy, just tacos and beer in the courtyard. You should stay. Julian looked at the lopsided mug in his hand. I'd like that too. As she walked toward the exit, Julian watched her. She moved with the same grace as always, but there was a lightness to her step he hadn't seen in years. At the door, she paused and looked back at him. By the way, Julian, she called out, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "The pottery app algorithm. I've patented it for the medical field. It's being used to track organ transplant viability now." Julian laughed, a real deep laugh that had no edge of mockery. "Of course it is. I should have known better than to bet against the hobbyist." Clara winked at him and vanished through the heavy oak doors. Julian picked up his pen and returned to his files. He was no longer a titan of tech. He was a man with a lopsided mug and a plywood desk, helping a new generation of dreamers build things that mattered. And as the sun set over the Mission District, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 2 years had passed since the night the Hive Shield saved Aura Connect, and a year since Julian Vance had moved his permanent office out of the skyscraper and into the heart of the Mission District. The rainy season had returned to San Francisco, but tonight, the moisture in the air didn't feel heavy or oppressive. It felt like a cleansing. The Phoenix Initiative was hosting its biennial Founders Showcase. The warehouse was transformed. The plywood desks had been moved to the perimeter, replaced by elegant glass pedestals and soft, recessed lighting. The walls were lined with large-scale photographs of the women whose lives had been altered, not just by capital, but by the belief that their work mattered. Julian stood in a quiet corner, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. He watched the room with the detached pride of a gardener looking at a blooming orchard. He saw Maya, now a seasoned CEO, explaining her textile blockchain to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. He saw Sarah Jenkins, her denim shirt replaced by a silk blouse, laughing with the same venture capitalists who had once called her a hobbyist. The viral video of Julian at the steakhouse was now a historical footnote, a case study taught in business schools about the cost of arrogance and the path to redemption. Julian didn't flinch when he saw it mentioned anymore. It was a story about a man who had died so that he could finally live. "You're hiding again, Julian." He turned to see Clara Ara. She looked radiant in a deep emerald dress, her platinum hair styled in soft waves. On her lapel was a small custom-made brooch, a golden sparrow. "Not hiding," Julian said, offering a small smile. "Just observing the data, the human data. It's much more interesting than the heart rate logs." Clara stepped up beside him, her shoulder nearly brushing his. "Maya's app just facilitated its millionth transaction. The Quiche Weavers are sending a representative to the UN next month. They want us to go with them." Julian looked at her, the gravity of the moment settling in his chest. "You should go, Clara. You're the one who built the map." "We built the bridge, Julian," she corrected gently. She gestured toward the center of the room, where a new exhibit had been unveiled. It wasn't a piece of tech or a logistics chart. It was a display of original pottery from the very first days of Artisan's Forge, presented alongside the most advanced bio-integrated AI wearables from Aura Connect. In the center of the display sat the kintsugi sparrow. The light hit the gold-filled cracks, making them glow like veins of sunlight. A small plaque beneath it read, "Nothing is ever truly broken. It is merely reimagined." "I remember thinking that bird was the end of everything," Julian whispered, "the night I swept it off the table. I thought I was cleaning up my life. I thought I was getting rid of the small things so I could be big." "And now?" Clara asked. Julian took a slow breath, the scent of lavender and rain-damped pavement drifting through the open skylights. "Now I realize that the small things were the only things holding the world together. The big things, the valuations, the titles, the empires, they're just the scaffolding. If the heart isn't right, the building falls." They walked together toward the back of the warehouse where a small, private workshop was tucked away. It was a place where founders could go to tinker, to get their hands dirty when the code became too abstract. On a table sat 2 lumps of wet grey clay. "You haven't sat at a wheel in 3 years, Julian," Clara said, her eyes twinkling with a challenge. "I was never any good at it, Clara, you know that. My hands are too clumsy." "The hands aren't the problem," she said, stepping behind a wheel and expertly centering her clay. "It's the heart. You have to listen to the mud. You can't force it to scale. You have to let it find its own shape." Julian sat at the adjacent wheel. He rolled up his sleeves, exposing the expensive watch he still wore, a gift to himself from the day Aura Connect went public. He hesitated for a second, then unbuckled the watch and set it on the table. He dipped his hands in the water and touched the clay. It was cold, slippery, and completely resistant to his will. For the first few minutes, he struggled. He tried to dominate it, to shape it into something perfect, and the clay collapsed into a slumped, grey mess. Clara didn't laugh. She didn't offer a critique. She just kept her hands steady, her own pot rising in a graceful, symmetrical curve. Julian stopped. He closed his eyes. He listened to the hum of the wheel, the sound of the rain on the roof, and the quiet breathing of the woman beside him. He stopped trying to be a CEO. He stopped trying to be a titan. He just tried to be present. His hands softened. He felt the center. Slowly, almost magically, the clay began to rise. It wasn't perfect. It was slightly lopsided, the walls a bit thick, but it was a vessel. It could hold something. "There," Clara whispered. Julian opened his eyes. He looked at the humble, messy bowl he had created. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever built. "It's a start," Julian said. "It's a masterpiece," Clara replied. She reached out with a wooden tool and etched a small mark into the base of her pot. Then she handed the tool to Julian. He took it and, with a steady hand, etched his own initials next to hers. As the party continued in the other room, the sounds of laughter and the clinking of glasses celebrating a world of billions, Julian and Clara sat in the quiet workshop, their hands covered in mud, their hearts finally in sync. The billionaire investor and the redeemed CEO weren't thinking about market caps or global disruption. They were looking at a piece of clay, marveling at the strength of the repair and the quiet, hopeful beauty of a future built on the ruins of the past. The rain outside finally faded into a soft mist, and as the lights of San Francisco twinkled through the fog, the gold on the sparrow in the gallery seemed to catch the very last of the light, shining with the brilliance of a story that had finally found its true north. Thank you for joining us for this cinematic journey of redemption and resilience. Julian and Clara's story reminds us that true success isn't found in the height of our empires, but in the depth of our connections and the courage to admit when we are wrong. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to change, and subscribe for more deep-dive dramas that explore the heart of the human experience. Your support helps us tell stories that matter. See you in the next one.